Story 1. The Bridges That Became Towns. Imagine standing at the center of a medieval bridge, not a quiet stone span over water, but a bustling street lined with wooden buildings that lean toward one another like weary travelers. Beneath your feet, the river moves with a slow, deliberate power. Above you, chimney smoke curls between slanted roofs. The sound is not of rushing water, but of merchants calling prices, of wheels creaking over timber planks, of conversation drifting in the cold morning air. You might smell fish, bread, wax, or damp wool, the ordinary perfume of medieval commerce. This was not an uncommon scene in the cities of medieval Europe. The idea of a bridge as a living place, not just a crossing, was so natural that for centuries people saw no contradiction in building homes, workshops, and entire parishes atop narrow stone spans. The Old London Bridge, completed in the early 13th century, was perhaps the most famous of them all. It stretched across the Thames with 19 stone arches, its surface thick with houses, shops, and chapels. For those who lived there, it was a world unto itself, a floating neighborhood that swayed slightly with the current below. But how did such an idea come to be? Why did medieval builders, who already struggled to raise bridges across dangerous waters, decide to load them with extra weight wood, stone, even entire guild halls? The answer lies, as so many medieval answers do, in necessity, opportunity, and the peculiar relationship people once had with the land and the water. The bridge as a space of survival. To understand the bridge as more than architecture, one must begin with the medieval landscape. Rivers were not just boundaries, they were lifelines for trade, for fishing, for power. They were also unpredictable, prone to flood, freeze, or shift course. A bridge was an act of defiance against nature, and such defiance required constant care. Stone bridges, especially those with multiple spans, demanded immense investment, money, labor, and the permission of local lords or the church. Most were built and maintained by religious fraternities, called bridge brotherhoods or pontifical orders. Their members, sometimes monks, sometimes laymen, raised funds through alms and indulgences. A donor could buy salvation by financing a pier, a gatehouse, or even a single stone. In this way, bridges became both practical and spiritual endeavors. To cross one was to partake in an act of collective faith. To live on one was to live in the midst of that faith. But bridges were expensive to maintain. The constant pressure of water and ice eroded their piers. Fire, wind, and time damaged their wooden superstructures. And so, by the 12th century, builders began to solve the problem the medieval way, by inhabiting it. If you placed houses on the bridge, you could rent them out. If you placed shops, you could tax them. The income from these structures paid for repairs, guards, and priests. What had started as a crossing became a self-sustaining ecosystem. The rise of the bridge town. London was not alone. Across Europe, bridge towns appeared wherever trade and traffic converged. The Pont Notre Dame in Paris, rebuilt in stone around 1500, carried 60 houses across the Seine. The Pont Vecchio in Florence, lined with butchers, shops before they gave way to goldsmiths, turned the Arno into a marketplace. Even smaller cities like Bath in England or Regensburg in Germany built similar hybrids of commerce and infrastructure. Each bridge was unique, shaped by local customs and constraints. Yet all shared a strange duality. They were both fixed and fragile, both public and private. A bridge could belong to the city, but the houses upon it might belong to dozens of individuals, each with their own rights, tenants, and obligations. In London, a single pier might host 3 families and a business, all stacked one above the other. Rooms leaned over the water, supported by timbers sunk into the current. Waste and washwater drained directly below. The river was not only a highway but a sewer, a reflection of the medieval indifference to the invisible dangers of sanitation. To live on a bridge was to live in constant motion. The vibration of carts could shake furniture, the thunder of hooves could rattle crockery. Yet residents spoke fondly of their bridge homes, for they offered something rare: connection. You were at the very heart of urban life, halfway between two shores, in a place everyone passed but few truly inhabited. Commerce over water. Economically, bridges were ideal real estate. Foot traffic meant customers, and the limited space meant exclusivity. A butcher on the Pont Vecchio could see more patrons in a morning than a shopkeeper in the city lanes. The trade in bread, books, and baubles thrived atop these narrow spans. On London Bridge, goldsmiths worked beside haberdashers, apothecaries mixed powders in the shadow of barbers. There were even small taverns, though open flames posed constant danger. To modern eyes, it seems chaotic a city balanced precariously on its own arteries. But to medieval sensibilities, it was ingenious. Water separated communities and bridges rejoined them. By turning crossings into marketplaces, cities turned necessity into profit. Still, the weight of all this life took its toll. In 1212, a great fire began on the Southwark end of London Bridge and spread to the northern side. Many of those trapped between the flames perished in the river. The bridge was rebuilt, yet the pattern continued: destruction, repair, habitation, decay. It became, in essence, a living organism, one that aged, shed, and regrew with each generation. Faith and function. Many medieval bridges carried not just houses and shops, but chapels. The logic was both practical and spiritual. A traveler setting out on a dangerous journey might stop to pray for safety. A merchant crossing with valuable cargo might offer a candle to St. Nicholas or St. Benezet, patron saints of bridge builders. The chapel of St. Thomas Becket on London Bridge stood midway across, serving as both a shrine and a toll house. Donations gathered there went to maintain the structure, while its presence reminded passers-by that every crossing was a kind of pilgrimage. These bridge chapels became small centers of devotion, but also of bureaucracy. The priests who served them kept records of rents, deaths, and repairs. Their ledgers tell stories of carpenters paid in ale, of masons fined for late work, of widows seeking shelter above the piers. In these details, one glimpses the true soul of the medieval bridge, not as a monument to engineering, but as a framework for ordinary lives. Life between shores. To live on a bridge was to exist in a liminal space between one city quarter and another, between the safety of home and the uncertainty of travel. Children played on walkways suspended above the current. Washerwomen leaned from windows to rinse cloths in the water below. There were accidents, of course. In winter, ice could pile against the piers and crack the masonry. In spring, floods could sweep away entire shops, yet few left voluntarily. The bridge was more than shelter, it was identity. Residents were known as bridge folk, a term both affectionate and slightly wary, as if they belonged to a place apart. When night fell, gates at either end were closed. The bridge became a fortress. Watchmen patrolled with lanterns. The sound of the river blended with creaking beams. In such moments, the medieval bridge was less a street than a ship moored, yet adrift in time. The slow collapse of the bridge town. By the 17th century, these inhabited bridges began to vanish. As cities grew, the congestion became unbearable. Fires, floods, and accidents took their toll. The bridges could no longer bear the weight of modern traffic. In London, the houses on the old bridge were finally demolished in the 1750s. Paris followed suit soon after. Florence's Pont Vecchio alone survived. Its shops transformed from butchers' stalls into glittering jewelers' displays, a sanitized echo of its former chaos. Yet something was lost in that transition. The bridge had once been a social space, a point of mingling between classes and trades. Once stripped bare, it became only infrastructure again, efficient, silent, and lifeless. Modern cities built wider, cleaner spans, but none were as alive. The bridge as memory. Today, only fragments remain: a carved stone here, a foundation beneath the mud, an old print showing crooked roofs above arching piers. But the idea of the bridge town endures, buried in the architecture of urban life. The medieval instinct to fill every space, to turn even the crossing into habitation, reflects a world where no inch of land was wasted, where necessity and imagination coexisted. When you walk across a modern bridge, a clean expanse of steel and asphalt, you walk across absence. The noise of cars has replaced the chatter of merchants, the smell of exhaust, the scent of bread. Yet if you pause and listen carefully, you might still sense the ghost of that older rhythm, the hum of commerce, the clatter of hooves, the river breathing beneath the planks. You stand, as they once did, between two shores suspended not just over water, but over time. And so we return to the question: how did people live, day after day, on a strip of stone above a restless river, and what did they think as the world changed around them? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine waking up on a medieval bridge. The floor beneath you creaks slightly, though the stone beneath that is firm, a paradox of motion and permanence. The walls of your home lean outward, as many do here, to steal an extra foot of space above the river. You rise with the sound of hooves and cart wheels just inches from your door, and the scent of bread baking two doors down drifts in through a wooden shutter. This was life for thousands of people across Europe, not just above the river, but within it. The bridge was not a pause between places, but a destination in its own right. Architecture in tension. The buildings on bridges were often timber-framed, lightweight enough to perch precariously above the arches. Most stood 2 or 3 stories high, often jetted, meaning each upper floor extended slightly beyond the one below. This allowed more interior space without blocking the passage below, though it also made the walkways feel narrow and slightly claustrophobic. In some places, the buildings on opposite sides of the bridge nearly touched at the top, creating a tunnel-like effect. Roofs were typically pitched steeply to shed rain and snow into the river. Windows were few and small glass was a luxury, and shutters often served double duty for light and protection. Drainage systems were rudimentary at best. Chamber pots were often emptied directly into the river. Some wealthier residents had rudimentary gutters leading to open spouts over the side, which could drench unsuspecting passers-by below. This may sound squalid by modern standards, and in some ways it was. But consider the ingenuity required. Builders had to compensate for vibrations from traffic, weight distribution across uneven piers, and constant exposure to damp. The fact that so many of these structures stood for centuries is a quiet testament to their skill. These were not temporary shelters, but engineered habitats built under constant constraint. Who lived on the bridge? Residents of the bridges were as varied as the cities themselves. In London, records show that butchers, booksellers, fishmongers, tailors, and clergy all lived side by side. Some homes were owned by merchants who worked the shopfront below. Others were rented out to tenants, including apprentices and laborers. Many homes were multi-generational, grandparents, parents, and children all sharing tight quarters. Space was so limited that it wasn't uncommon for families to use the same bed in shifts. Privacy, in the modern sense, barely existed. Curtains and thin partitions marked the boundaries of personal space. The bridge also offered lodging to travelers. Rooms were let by the night, sometimes nothing more than a cot beside the hearth. Inns and taverns operated along the bridge, especially at the gates. A visitor arriving in the city might sleep, eat, and purchase supplies without ever leaving the span. Children played in narrow lanes, dodging carts and calling to one another from upper windows. Tradesmen sharpened knives on stoops. Laundry was strung between buildings like sails. There was a constant low hum of human life, not bustling in the loud sense, but steady, ceaseless, ordinary. Trade and regulation. Bridge commerce was a regulated ecosystem, especially in cities like London and Florence. On London Bridge, for example, shops were carefully assigned and monitored by city officials. Certain trades were clustered: booksellers near the center, butchers toward the ends, where waste could be disposed of more easily. Guilds maintained strict control over who could sell what, where, and for how much. Prices were fixed in many cases, weights and measures inspected, and penalties issued for fraud. A seller caught using false weights might be fined, publicly shamed, or even dunked into the river from a special punishment chair. These controls were not just economic, they were political. The bridge was a visible representation of city order. To keep it running, to keep it clean and fair, was to prove the competence of the city government. That's why so many cities placed watchmen, inspectors, and even clerks on the bridge itself. It functioned not just as a market, but as a kind of municipal nerve center. The chapel in the middle. Many bridges contained a chapel, often near the center of the span. These served as spiritual checkpoints and practical offices. In London, the Chapel of St. Thomas Becket was a full two-story structure, complete with an altar above and a crypt below. Pilgrims and merchants alike would pause to light candles before continuing their journey. The lower chapel often held records rents collected from the houses, fees from tolls, and maintenance logs. In effect, the chapel was also the accounting office for the bridge. The choice of Becket was not accidental. As a recently martyred saint, he represented resistance to royal power and appealing figure for a city that guarded its liberties jealously. By building a chapel in his honor, the citizens made a statement. This was sacred space, but also civic space. The bridge belonged to them. The seasons of the bridge. Life on the bridge changed with the seasons. In winter, ice floes threatened the arches, and foot traffic slowed. Watchmen chopped at forming ice to keep water flowing, while residents huddled indoors around smoky hearths. The limited space meant many relied on communal ovens or street braziers, increasing the fire risk. In spring, the river swelled with snowmelt. Flooding wasn't just a concern for those below the bridge's supports could shift or weaken, causing shops to tilt. Repair crews moved in, often working while business continued around them. Summer brought smells good and bad. Bakers and tanners increased their output, and the river beneath warmed to a slow, thick crawl. But the heat also brought disease. Outbreaks of plague, typhoid, or dysentery sometimes spread more quickly among bridge dwellers than elsewhere, owing to the density and shared water sources. In autumn, harvests arrived in carts that rattled across the stones. Children returned from the fields, fishers sold their catch by the gates, and merchants prepared for the Michaelmas fairs. Life on the bridge was always changing, yet always the same. Risks and ruins. The most famous bridge disasters were often caused by fire. The combination of timber structures, open flames, and high winds made conflagration a constant threat. The Great Fire of 1212 on London Bridge killed an estimated 3,000 people, many trapped between burning ends with nowhere to go but the river. Another fire in 1633 destroyed the northern third of the bridge. After that, rebuilding began in earnest, using brick and stone instead of wood. Even so, collapse remained a risk. In 1282, the Elvet Bridge in Durham lost several shops to flooding. The old EXE Bridge in Exeter was so damaged by rising waters that it was eventually abandoned in favor of a newer span. Across Europe, one can find records of partial collapses, lost shops, and sudden deaths. And yet people returned, shops reopened, homes were rebuilt. For every catastrophe there was recovery. This was not carelessness but commitment. The bridge offered something rare: proximity, community, opportunity. Those who lived there knew the risks and chose to remain. A microcosm of the city. To study life on the bridge is to study urban history in miniature. Every function of the city: trade, religion, governance, defense was mirrored there in compressed form. There were markets, but also toll houses to regulate trade. There were homes, but also guard posts to secure the entrances. There were shrines, but also public punishments, like stocks or pillories, stationed at the gates. In this way, the bridge was not an anomaly but an intensified city block. It embodied the crowded, creative, chaotic nature of medieval life. It revealed how much could be done in tight quarters, how space could be stretched and layered to accommodate need. Even the language reflects this compression. In London, people spoke of going over the bridge as a journey not just between banks but between worlds. To cross it was to pass through a crucible to be jostled, observed, taxed, blessed, and perhaps transformed. The bridge in decline. By the 1700s, changing tastes and technologies began to render the inhabited bridge obsolete. Cities wanted wider, cleaner, faster crossings. Commerce had shifted toward ports and paved streets. The houses were seen as obstructions, their charm replaced by concerns about fire and congestion. In 1756, the City of London ordered the demolition of the buildings on the old bridge. The process took several years and was met with mixed feelings. Some saw it as progress, others as erasure. Travelers who had once marveled at the bridge's density now wrote of its emptiness. The chapel was gone. The markets were moved. The bridge, once alive with shouts and smells, now echoed with silence. Florence kept its Ponte Vecchio shops, but elsewhere the pattern held. The bridge was uncluttered, made efficient and less human. What remains? Today, only a handful of inhabited bridges survive. The Kremmerbrück in Erfurt, Germany, still houses shops. The Ponte Vecchio remains a tourist hub, but the rest have vanished, their stones repurposed, their spaces paved over. Yet their memory lingers. The idea of the bridge town lives on in covered markets, arcades, and even shopping malls. These are places that combine passage and purchase, movement and pause. They echo the medieval instinct to make every inch serve multiple purposes. To walk a modern bridge is to feel that absence. It is to sense what once was. Lives layered like bricks, commerce stacked like stories, devotion raised above the waterline. And so we end with a question. When a city forgets the places where people lived and worked in its very arteries, what parts of itself does it lose? What does it mean to build a home between two worlds? To live not fully on one shore or the other, but suspended literally and socially in the middle space, carried only by stone and trust. For centuries, those who made their lives on bridges lived in such a state of in-between. They did not see it as peculiar. There was no novelty in hanging laundry over water, no hesitation in cooking over a hearth set above a river's current. They lived in what they had, where they could, and what they had for a time was one of the cleverest inventions of the medieval world, the inhabited bridge. We'll examine what the river ultimately took away, and what perhaps it left behind. A view from the shore. By the time the 18th century arrived in London, the old bridge had become not just outdated, but a symbol of past congestion. City planners and Enlightenment thinkers favored symmetry, straight lines, and broad, open views. The cluttered dwellings and overhanging shops of London Bridge were now described in travelogues as dark, cramped, even dangerous. One foreign observer called it a narrow artery choked with the dust of centuries. It was more than just aesthetics. Fire was a constant threat. The 1633 blaze that destroyed the northern third of the bridge had nearly reached the southern bank, an event still vivid in the city's memory. Traffic had also increased. Carriages, once rare, had become common, and the narrow lanes between bridge buildings were barely wide enough to accommodate them. So in 1756, a monumental decision was made. The houses on London Bridge would be demolished. The process was not swift. It took over a decade, beginning with the relocation of residents and merchants, then the removal of the chapel, and finally the clearing of the last roof lines and overhangs. In 1762, for the first time in centuries, the bridge stood bare. It was hailed as progress, but not by all. The bridge dismantled, the community displaced. The removal of the bridge houses was, in effect, the erasure of a neighborhood. Hundreds of people, families, traders, travelers, clergy lost not only their homes and businesses, but also their place in the city's rhythm. Many of them could not afford the higher rents on land-based shops. Others lost their identity entirely. To be from the bridge had meant something specific, a life between two halves of the city, a life shaped by trade and flow. Contemporary records show disputes over compensation, petitions to remain, and letters of protest. But history, as it often does, moved forward with little regard. The stone structure that once held such weight, both literal and human, was now streamlined for efficiency. Yet the question lingers: what was lost when the bridge became only a bridge? The symbolic power of bridges. In many cultures, bridges have represented more than infrastructure. They symbolize transition, connection, and passage, both physically and spiritually. The Latin root pons, bridge, is related to the word pontiff, a term for a spiritual bridge builder. In medieval Europe, this symbolism was lived rather than abstracted. The bridge was where pilgrims paused before entering a city, where the condemned crossed before execution, where guild members gathered before festivals. It was a threshold space, a place of transformation. By placing homes, shops, and chapels on bridges, medieval society acknowledged this symbolism and lived within it. To inhabit the bridge was to participate in its meaning, to become part of the great act of connection that cities required to survive. Even bridge chapels carried this weight. The Chapel of St. Thomas on London Bridge was not merely a shrine, it was a spiritual fulcrum. Donations made their funded repairs to the very stones people crossed. To give was to sustain the city itself. And so, when the bridge was cleared, this spiritual and symbolic layer vanished as well. A shift in urban thinking. The decline of the bridge town did not happen all at once. In many cities, it was a gradual process tied to changing ideas of urban space. In the medieval mindset, space was layered. Streets could be markets, churches could be warehouses, bridges could be homes. Boundaries were fluid and functionality was prized over formality. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, cities were embracing a new ideology: separation of function. Markets were placed in dedicated halls. Residences moved to new suburbs. Bridges were reimagined as arteries of pure transit. Cleanliness, order, and visibility became architectural virtues. This change reflected not only aesthetic preferences, but also public health concerns, military strategy, and economic theory. Narrow bridge shops were viewed as obstacles to trade and governance. The unpredictability of their layout offended modern sensibilities. By 1831, the old London Bridge, now stripped of buildings, was demolished entirely and replaced by a newer, wider span. Even that would be replaced again in the 20th century. And so, stone by stone, the bridge town was not just removed, it was unremembered. Remnants and echoes. Still traces remain. In Florence, the Ponte Vecchio endures, lined with jewelry shops. It alone survives the old tradition, protected by Renaissance aesthetics and modern tourism. Its original butchers and tanners are long gone, but the bones of the structure remain overhanging, jetted, leaning out over the Arno just as they did centuries ago. In Erfurt, Germany, the Kremmerbruck remains a working bridge street, with buildings dating back to the 15th century. Cobblers, potters, and painters now work where tailors and wool merchants once did. In both places, the experience of crossing is unique. Not an absence of space, but a presence of it, layered, inhabited, lived. Old prints and woodcuts also preserve the memory. They show bridges as bustling, bent under the weight of life. Look closely and you'll see details. A child chasing a dog, a woman dumping water, a priest in his stall. These are not imagined scenes, they are fragments of truth, captured before the stone was cleared. What the bridge meant. So what did it mean in the end to live on a bridge? It meant to live with constant vibration, to be shaken not by metaphor but by hoof and wheel. It meant to live in exposure to wind, to smoke, to danger, but also in closeness, to trade, to community, to movement. It meant to live between, not within. For the medieval mind, perhaps this was natural. After all, much of their life was lived in flux between feast and famine, between war and truce, between salvation and sin. A bridge, then, was not an odd place to dwell. It was the perfect metaphor for life itself, always moving, always temporary, always connected. Modern reflections. Today, when we look at infrastructure, we often see it as impersonal. Bridges are for cars, streets are for traffic, underpasses are forgotten. But perhaps the medieval Bridgetown reminds us that even the most utilitarian structures can and did contain human lives. There is growing interest now in mixed-use spaces, in urban repurposing, in bringing life back to the forgotten corners of cities. Artists transform old viaducts into studios. Cafes pop up in train stations. Parks are built on elevated rails. These ideas are not new. They echo what the bridge once embodied. And so, in some quiet way, the Bridgetown lives again, not in the form of medieval timber, but in the spirit of reuse, of overlap, of closeness. The instinct to live above the current, to find home in transit, remains. A final crossing. You reach the end of the bridge, now, as night falls. The shutters are closed, the doors latched, the river silent beneath your feet. The candles inside flicker softly. A pot of stew simmers. A book lies open. Outside, the wind tugs at signs above the shops, and the city beyond waits just across the span. The bridge is not just something you cross, it is something you pass through, something that contains part of your journey. And perhaps that's the lesson. History, like a river, often flows past the places where people once lived. But if you pause, if you stop at the midpoint and look closely, you might still see them there. The children, the traders, the priests, the noise, the smells, the life. All of it suspended between two shores. It is early morning and the stone walls are still dark. Outside, the world is black with cold mist, but inside the cloister, someone is already awake. A monk moves quietly through a corridor, his sandals soft on the worn flagstones. He carries no candle, for he knows every step of this path. He does not need to see. He is listening not for voices or for wind, but for time. Then faint and clear comes the sound, a soft, high-pitched whistle from the water clock chamber, followed by a subtle hiss. A candle mark has burned down. A floating bob rises. The hour is arrived. He nods, bows once in the darkness, and moves toward the bell tower. It is time to call the brethren to matins, the first service of the day. The monastery begins to stir. This was how time moved in the medieval monastery, not by tick or tock, but by flow, fire, chant, and silence. Long before mechanical clocks, monks were among the most meticulous keepers of time in the world. They did so not for commerce or politics, but for prayer, and in doing so, they quietly laid the foundations of a new temporal order. Time without clocks. Before the 14th century, mechanical timekeeping as we know it did not exist. There were no gears, pendulums, or standardized dials. Instead, time was understood organically through the movement of the sun, the flow of water, the burning of candles, or the sounding of bells. It was not abstract, it was embodied. In most villages and towns, life moved according to nature's rhythm. People rose with the light and slept with the dark. Work followed the seasons, plowing in spring, harvest in fall, fasting in winter. There was no need to count minutes. The day was divided roughly: morning, midday, afternoon, dusk. But in the monastery, this would not do. Monastic life required regularity, and regularity demanded measurement. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, laid out a schedule of 8 daily prayers, the divine office, each tied to specific hours. These were: matins during the night, lauds at dawn, prime first hour of daylight, terce third hour, sext sixth hour midday, none ninth hour mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, compline before sleep. For a monastery to function, it had to mark these hours with precision. Even if the sun was hidden, even if the days were short or long, the hours had to be observed, not guessed. Thus arose one of the most important but least remembered duties in the monastic world: the keeping of the hours. The timekeeper's tools. The monk responsible for measuring time might have a variety of tools, depending on the century, the region, and the resources of the monastery. The most common included water clocks, clepsydry, a vessel slowly filled or emptied by dripping water. A float would rise or fall, triggering a marker or bell. Candle clocks, tall candles marked with intervals. As each section burned down, time passed. Sundials, installed in cloisters or on tower walls, these provided daytime calibration but were useless at night or in clouds. Astrolabes and nocturnals, used to track stars and determine the night hours during certain seasons. Human memory and routine. Often, monks themselves became clocks trained to wake, watch, and call the hours by intuition and habit. In many monasteries, especially in early medieval England or Francia, the sacrist or precentor, a senior monk, was responsible for maintaining these devices. He might rise during the night to inspect the water clock or watch the stars, ensuring that matins did not begin too early or too late. In winter, this was an especially harsh task. In larger monasteries, teams of monks rotated this duty. Their schedules were staggered so someone was always alert, always listening. This, too, was a form of devotion. Living by the bell. The bell was the voice of time in the medieval monastery. Its sound cut through silence like a thread through cloth, drawing the community together and dividing one part of the day from another. Bells were rung by hand, often from a tower or a small steeple above the chapel. They did not always toll the hour exactly, not in the way we expect from a modern town clock. Instead, they marked moments. Time to pray, time to eat, time to sleep. This rhythm of life was called the horarium, and it governed everything. A monk's day might begin at 2:30 a.m. for matins, followed by quiet study, then lauds at sunrise, then labor in the fields, reading at midday, more prayers, more work, vespers at sunset, compline in the dark. The day was not rushed, it was full but slow. Importantly, monks did not own time. They did not think of it as something to be saved or spent. Time was given by God through creation, and their job was to receive it with discipline. This concept would linger in European thought long after the clocks came. Clocks from within. Historians sometimes describe monasteries as clocks before clocks. That is, they functioned like machines of time even before machines existed to measure time. The monastery itself was a kind of living clock, with its walls forming the housing, its bells the chimes, and its monks the gears. And like a clock, a well-run monastery could regulate more than itself. In many towns, especially in the early medieval period, the monastery's bell tower was the only time signal. Townspeople would hear it and set their day by it, rising when lauds rang, breaking at sext, resting after compline. Time leaked outward, slowly regulating the rhythms of the town beyond the walls. Even the language of time began to reflect this. The canonical hours gave rise to common terms. Noon comes from nun, the ninth hour of daylight. Matins survives in liturgical settings. Vespers is still used in reference to evening services. Without intending it, monks began to structure time not just for themselves, but for Europe. The gradual rise of mechanized time. By the 13th century, Europe began to change. Trade routes expanded, markets grew, universities were founded. Cities demanded coordination for deliveries, meetings, lectures, sermons. The organic time of sunrise and sunset no longer sufficed. Urban life wanted precision. At the same time, monastic scholars in England and Italy began developing mechanical escapement systems, early attempts to regulate motion using levers and weights. These laid the groundwork for the first mechanical clocks, which emerged around 1300. The earliest were installed in church towers still tied to prayer, but they soon spread to public squares, and then to merchant halls, and finally to homes. The church had measured time to serve God. Now the city measured time to serve commerce. And yet, even in this transformation, the monastic rhythm lingered. Public clocks still chimed 8 times a day. Townspeople still spoke of the bell at sext or rising at lauds. The sacred calendar quietly underpinned the secular one. The monks, once alone in their measurement of the hours, had trained an entire civilization to listen. A world before minutes. It is worth pausing here literally to reflect on a strange truth. For most of human history, minutes did not exist. People did not have 5 minutes, nor did they run late by 10. Time was broad, approximate, relational. You met someone after the bell or before the sun was too high. You worked while the light lasted. You prayed when the stars aligned. The minute, the precise, measurable, anxious little unit, is a modern invention. It arrived not with the candle or the bell, but with the gear, the spring, the pendulum. Before that, time flowed like water, burned like wax, sounded like chant. It was enough. The monks did not count time. They lived it. You've heard the bell. It sounds across the valley in the pale morning light, echoing off trees and cottages. For centuries, this tone marked more than an hour, it marked order. And it did so because somewhere within the cloister walls, a monk had risen long before you, checked the water clock or candle, and prepared the mechanism that would sound the signal. But now that bell is tied to something else. No longer dependent on flame or dripping water, it is struck by a mechanism of iron, leather, and weight. A gear turns, a hammer swings, and time moves automatically. We are entering a new era, the era when monastic timekeeping evolved into mechanical timekeeping, and in doing so, gave rise to one of the most quietly revolutionary inventions in European history, the clock. This section will explore how monks, in their quiet devotion to order, helped birth a tool that eventually came to regulate not only religious life, but factories, armies, empires, and daily existence itself. When time became a machine. The earliest recorded mechanical clocks appeared in Europe around the year 1300. They did not look like clocks in the modern sense. There were no hands or faces. Instead, they rang bells at fixed intervals using a series of weights, ropes, and escapement mechanisms. These clocks did not measure hours precisely. Rather, they divided time into parts, regular, predictable portions. One of the first such clocks is attributed to the Cathedral of Salisbury in England, constructed around 1386. It still works today. It has no dial, only a bell and a hammer. The escapement, a brilliant yet simple mechanical concept, was the key. It regulated the movement of a wheel, allowing it to turn in controlled steps rather than spinning freely. Each tick or tock represented a measured release of force, the mechanical equivalent of a monk observing the stars or watching water rise. In short, the escapement did what the monks had done for centuries, but now, it did it without sleep, without prayer, without thought. Why monasteries built the first clocks? It might seem odd that monks, who lived apart from the world and eschewed materialism, would help create one of the most impactful inventions of the age. But in truth, no one needed clocks more than monks. The rule of St. Benedict demanded 8 canonical prayer hours daily regardless of season, weather, or geography. Before mechanical clocks, monks had to wake at irregular times throughout the night to observe the schedule. In winter, when nights were long, matins might begin in complete darkness, sometimes just 3 hours after Compline had ended. This placed an enormous burden on the sacrist, the monk responsible for keeping the time and waking the community. In larger monasteries, he might be assisted by novices, but in smaller houses, he alone carried the task of guarding the rhythm of monastic life. The idea of a machine, a device that could toll the bell automatically at intervals, was not a convenience, but a gift from God. It ensured that prayer was timely and orderly, even if the body failed. And so, monasteries became early adopters of mechanical clocks. Many commissioned them directly. Others built them in-house, combining the metalworking talents of monastic smiths with the observational skills of monk astronomers. The bell tower, from cloister to city. Once installed in monastic bell towers, clocks began to take on another function: public regulation. In many towns, especially those centered around a cathedral or abbey, the monastery's clock became the town's timekeeper. Its chimes structured life beyond the cloister, calling workers to the fields, opening markets, beginning trials, ending curfews. The monastic bell tower evolved into the civic clock tower. Examples include Rouen, France. In the early 14th century, the abbey's clock was visible and audible across the town, regulating both sacred and secular life. Milan, Italy. A mechanical clock installed in the cathedral tower struck a large bronze bell that could be heard for miles, coordinating market activity and municipal announcements. Nuremberg, Germany. The city's clock tower was modeled on monastic prototypes, though by the 15th century it had become fully secularized. In this way, monastic timekeeping leaked into the town square and then overtook it. The philosophy of measured time. In monastic life, time was not a resource to be used, it was a structure to be obeyed. The clock didn't make time faster, it made it visible, external, neutral. This shift changed how people thought. Before the clock, time was personal and natural. After the clock, time became communal and artificial. You no longer rose with the sun, you rose at 7. You didn't meet when the shadow was shortest, but at noon. This abstraction of time into uniform, repeating segments marked the beginning of what some historians call temporal discipline, the idea that human lives should conform to fixed schedules. For monks, this was familiar. They had lived by a schedule for centuries. But for merchants, artisans, and farmers, it was new. And once the concept took hold, it never left. Monastic innovations beyond the clock. Clocks were not the only way monasteries shaped time. Some houses developed calendar systems, adjusting prayer times seasonally. Others maintained astronomical charts, tracking solstices and equinoxes to better align their hours with natural light. In places like Cluny Abbey in France, elaborate musical sequences were developed for each hour, turning the passage of time into a liturgical performance. Monks also kept tide tables, especially in coastal abbeys, to help determine when prayers would coincide with safe fishing or travel. All of this reflected a simple truth: monastic life was not a retreat from time, but an intensification of it. The clock escapes the monastery. By the 15th century, clocks were appearing in town halls, merchant guilds, and cathedrals. Many of these included automata, small mechanical figures that rang bells or acted out scenes when the hour struck. These public clocks became symbols of civic pride. Cities competed to have the most elaborate mechanisms. Some clocks, like the one in Prague, featured zodiac dials and dancing skeletons. Others, like Strasbourg's, tracked the positions of the planets. Yet even as clocks became more elaborate, their spiritual roots remained. Most still struck canonical hours even if no one prayed at them anymore. Time, once monastic, had become municipal. Resistance to the clock. Not everyone welcomed the mechanical regulation of life. Some rural communities continued to ignore the bells, preferring the older rhythm of the sun and seasons. In remote parts of Europe, candle clocks and natural observation persisted well into the 17th century. Others feared that too much precision robbed time of its spiritual character. If you could measure the moment too exactly, did it still belong to God, or had it become yours to control? Writers like Erasmus and Montaigne questioned whether such measured living made people more virtuous or simply more anxious. Even within monasteries, some monks complained that the mechanical clock led to sloppiness. Relying too heavily on automation, they argued, could weaken the discipline of internal vigilance. Still, the tide could not be turned. Legacy, from prayer to punch cards. By the 18th and 19th centuries, timekeeping had become industrialized. Factories ran on schedules enforced by bells and whistles. Workers punched time cards to mark their shifts. Schools followed rigid hourly classes. Trains ran or didn't on timetables. And at the root of it all quietly, invisibly was the monk, alone in the darkness, watching the water rise. We owe much to these silent keepers of the hours, not only for the clocks themselves, but for the idea that time can be structured, shared, and made meaningful through ritual. Their world was not ruled by seconds or minutes, but by devotion, and it is that devotion that allowed them to build the first machines of time. It's hard now to imagine a world without minutes. You likely move through several of them, just getting here, maybe 5, maybe 10. A message glanced at, a window closed, a sip of tea, but each was counted, not consciously perhaps, but measured nonetheless. The ticking clock is silent to us now, internalized. The phone, the watch, the meeting invite, they regulate us invisibly, unquestioned. But once, not long ago, time was something to be heard, not read. A bell in the dark, a rising song, a flickering shadow on a stone wall. It did not push, it called. And in the quiet cloisters of medieval Europe, monks answered that call day after day for centuries. Theirs was not a life of invention for its own sake, nor of efficiency. It was a life of rhythm, rooted in repetition and devotion, and from it, the world's sense of time slowly emerged. We explore how that monastic rhythm echoed beyond the cloister into villages, cities, industry, and finally into the world we inhabit now, and how its legacy may still hold something for us, in a time too full of time. From sacred rhythm to civic order. By the 15th century, as mechanical clocks spread from abbey towers into town halls and marketplaces, the purpose of timekeeping slowly changed. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, vespers began to fade from public consciousness. In their place came the civic hour, the hour for markets to open, for meetings to begin, for curfews to fall. Bells still rang, but their meaning had shifted. Where once they had marked a call to prayer, now they regulated commerce, governance, and movement. Still, echoes of monastic structure remained. Workdays in many towns were divided into thirds or ninths, linguistic remnants of terce and none. Church bells continued to chime 7 or 8 times daily, even in places where no one attended the corresponding prayers. Festivals and holy days remained fixed to monastic calendars. Easter, Michaelmas, Candlemas, their timing derived from calculations developed by monks centuries earlier. In other words, timekeeping had moved from the sacred to the civic, but it had not forgotten its source. The reign of the clock. With the rise of cities, trade guilds, and universities, the need for precise, shared time only increased. By the 17th century, minute hands began to appear on clocks. The second hand followed. The rhythm of the monastic bell was replaced by the click of the escapement wheel, the tick of the pendulum. Time had become not just regulated but partitioned. This new precision was a marvel. It allowed for navigation at sea, scientific experimentation, synchronized trade, but it also introduced a new anxiety: lateness. In a monastery, one could miss the bell and still pray. In a city, one could miss the train. As clocks became smaller, first in towers, then in parlors, then in pockets, time became portable. People began to carry it with them, look at it, measure themselves by it. And so, paradoxically, as time became more visible, it also became more oppressive. The industrial clock. Nowhere was this more evident than in the rise of the factory. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as mechanized production transformed Europe and America, timekeeping became central to labor. Whistles replaced bells. Punch cards replaced prayer books. Where the monastic schedule had been interrupted by silence, the factory schedule was incessant. Shifts were fixed by the hour: work, rest, work again. Lunch breaks lasted exactly 30 minutes. Efficiency was tracked by seconds, and infractions being late, slowing down were punishable by fines or dismissal. Some historians have called this the era of temporal discipline. It was not enough to do your work, you had to do it on time, within time, for time. To the monks, time had been something to serve. To the modern worker, time became something to serve under. The same tool, the clock, had produced two entirely different ways of life. Echoes in the modern world. Today, the monastery is quiet again. Many of the great abbeys of Europe lie in ruins, their cloisters overgrown, their bells long silent. Others still function modestly as spiritual retreats or historical sites. In places like Monte Cassino, Cluny, and Westminster, time is still kept, still sung, still marked by the old rhythm. But the world outside moves differently now. We live by digital time measured in milliseconds, tracked by algorithms, updated by satellites. Our clocks don't tick, they refresh. Our calendars are packed. Our attention is scheduled. Even rest is optimized. And yet, there's a reason some people are drawn to slow living, to rituals, to ancient forms of structure. We may no longer hear the bell at lauds or none, but we feel its absence. A glance at the clock brings not reassurance, but restlessness. A full calendar offers not control, but exhaustion. In such a world, the quiet stability of monastic time, repetitive, cyclical, sacred, begins to look not outdated, but desirable. Recovering the hours. So what might it mean to recover some part of monastic time today? Not the cloister or the vow, but the rhythm. Some attempt this already, knowingly or not. The popularity of daily routines, morning rituals, and evening reflections often mirror the divine office, the breaking up of the day into meaningful pauses. Apps and journals now encourage users to track their hours not just for productivity, but for presence. Time blocking, a modern workplace strategy, echoes the Benedictine hour. There's a growing call to mark Sabbath, to create digital sunsets, to ring our own inner bells. It may be no coincidence that, in a world that measures time down to the nanosecond, people now seek practices that slow time, honor time, and listen to it again. In some way, perhaps, the monk's work continues. The bell never stops. Picture again the old monastery. The stone walls, the bell tower, the worn steps leading to a wooden door. Inside, a lone monk lights a candle. He glances at the water clock. He listens to the flow. The candle flickers. The float rises. It is time. He walks slowly to the rope and pulls. The bell rings out. It echoes across a sleeping valley, across centuries, perhaps. Its sound carries through time, through dust, through stone, until it reaches something within us. A reminder that time is not just a number, but a shape, not just a tool, but a rhythm. That there is time for prayer, time for labor, time for silence, and that perhaps the bell still rings not from a tower, but from the heart. So we close with one last question. If the monks once measured time to draw closer to meaning, how might we, in our world of noise and speed, learn to measure time gently again? Story 3. The mud beneath London. It's well after midnight. The streets of London are finally quiet. The last candles have burned low in their windows. The market carts are long gone. The Thames murmurs softly in the dark. The city sleeps. But down one narrow lane, just wide enough for a cart and a man, a soft slosh can be heard. A wooden wheel creaks. A shovel scrapes. A lantern flickers against a stone wall. And behind a high wooden fence, in the rear of a fine Georgian townhouse, a man in oilcloth climbs carefully into a pit. He is a nightman, a muck collector, a gong farmer. His work is unspoken but absolutely necessary. Tonight, like every night, he is doing the quiet work of removing human waste from the city. You may never have heard of these men. They rarely appear in history books or grand oil paintings. but they were as vital to urban life as merchants, masons, or mayors. Without them, the city would rot not metaphorically, but literally. This is their story. The problem of waste. For most of its long history, London, like nearly every city in Europe, lacked a formal sewage system. Streets were narrow, buildings dense, and population growth relentless. People lived in close quarters, shared yards, and often lacked running water. And yet every person, every day, produced waste. Chamber pots were common in households across class lines. Indoor plumbing, where it existed, was rudimentary and often drained into cesspits under the home or in the rear yard. The contents of those pits, human excrement mixed with straw, ash, urine, and kitchen waste, accumulated over time. Left unattended, they leaked into basements, into cellars, into streets. They bred insects. They contaminated wells. They stank a slow, sour, earthy stink that never quite left the air. So what was the solution? You dug it out by hand. And someone had to do it. The gong farmers. In the early modern period, roughly the 16th to 18th centuries, the men who took on this task were known as gong farmers. The word gong came from the Old English gang, meaning to go as in, to go to the privy. A gong was a pit toilet or cesspool. A gong farmer was the person who emptied it. They worked at night for practical and social reasons. Digging out cesspits by daylight was unpleasant for everyone involved. By law in Tudor London, gong farmers were only allowed to work after 9 p.m. and their carts had to be gone before morning. Out of sight, out of mind. Their tools were simple. A shovel or large wooden scoop, sometimes attached to a long pole. Heavy oilcloth clothing or waxed leather aprons. A handheld lantern or candle. And most importantly, a barrel cart, usually two-wheeled, often covered, pulled by a horse or mule. The work was hard, filthy, and dangerous. Pits could collapse. Gases could build up and suffocate a man before he had time to climb out. Rats were common. So were infections, sores, and persistent coughs. And yet it paid well. Dirty work, decent pay. Unlike many manual laborers of the time, gong farmers were relatively well compensated. The work was difficult and few people were willing to do it, so wages were high enough to support a modest household. In some cities, gong farmers were licensed by the local authorities. They paid a fee for the right to work in certain districts and were expected to dispose of waste at designated dumping grounds outside the city. In London, some of the waste was taken to fields on the city's outskirts or loaded onto barges and floated downriver. And here's the strange part. The muck they hauled, that foul mix of organic waste, was actually valuable. The economy of excrement. Night soil, as human waste was politely called, was rich in nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, the exact nutrients farmers needed to fertilize their fields. Long before synthetic fertilizers existed, rural farmers were eager for anything that could replenish exhausted soil. This led to a quiet but thriving trade between cities and the countryside. Gong farmers collected waste, transported it outside the city, and sold it to farmers who would spread it over their land. In effect, human waste became part of a nutrient cycle, from food to feces to fertilizer and back again. It wasn't glamorous, but it was sustainable. In this way, the humble nightman stood at the crossroads of urban sanitation and agricultural productivity. He cleaned the city and fed the land one shovelful at a time. Where it went. Records from early modern London show that night soil was commonly dumped at places like Kennel Fields near Whitechapel, marshes along the Thames, abandoned pits outside city walls, or more disturbingly, illegally into rivers, ditches, or even streets. Legal disposal was expensive and time-consuming. Some unscrupulous collectors, especially those unlicensed, would take shortcuts, dumping their loads in secluded alleys or shallow graves. This led to health crises, legal battles, and the rise of urban inspectors tasked with tracking and regulating night soil removal. Still, despite the challenges, most Gong farmers operated with a functional ethic. The city needed them, and they took pride in doing what no one else would. Social status and stigma. Despite their usefulness, Gong farmers occupied a strange position in society. They were essential but avoided, needed but unseen. They were often forced to live on the outskirts of towns, or in neighborhoods known for laborers and tradesmen. In some cities, they were barred from public festivals or banned from entering certain buildings during the day. Their children, too, were marked by the work. They might grow up apprenticed to the same trade, or try to move away, but the association with filth followed them. Yet among themselves, Gong farmers formed tight communities. They shared roots, tools, knowledge. Some had their own guilds or informal brotherhoods. In London's Southwark district, a group of nightmen were known to gather weekly not in the church, but in a public house called the Foul Anchor. They had their own humor, their own rituals, their own invisible pride. Hidden infrastructure. What made their job even harder was the lack of clear planning. Early cities like London had no formal sewage map. Every cesspit was different, some shallow, some deep, some in a cellar, some beneath the privy, some dry, others dangerously wet. Gong farmers had to know the layout of each building. They had to memorize the streets, the alleys, the gates. They knew where the best pits were and where the worst ones always overflowed. They were, in a strange way, the true cartographers of the city beneath the city. The smell of history. If you could step back into 17th century London, not in a dream or a movie, but in your body, the first thing you'd notice is the smell. Not just from the cesspits, but from everything. Unwashed wool, stagnant water, rotting food, tanneries, fishmongers, candles made from tallow. It was a world without deodorant, without soap in every home, without ventilation or refrigeration. And yet people lived. They adapted. They layered scent upon scent, herbs, vinegar, dried flowers. They accepted certain smells as facts of life. And in the middle of it all, trying to manage the worst of the worst, was the Gong farmer knee-deep in mud, beneath the polite surface of a growing empire. When we remember cities like London, we think of kings and towers, of cobblestones and cathedrals. But beneath all of that, hidden, ignored, and indispensable, was the mud. The city lies quiet above. Candles are snuffed, doorways latched, the alleys empty save for the soft sound of hooves and a sloshing barrel. But beneath the cobbles, in yards, cellars, and pits, another world waits, a world of dark tunnels, foul smells, and the slow accumulation of what the polite world does not wish to see. In this section, we go deeper into the logistics, organization, and invisible infrastructure behind the night soil, trade, the forgotten network that allowed London to grow without being consumed by its own waste. Mapping the invisible city. By the 18th century, London had become one of the largest and most densely populated cities in Europe. With its population soaring past 700,000, the city faced a pressing problem: where to put the byproducts of daily life, especially human waste. Despite growing concern over hygiene, there was still no central sewer system. Instead, the city relied on a distributed network of cesspits, open gutters, and the labor of private waste removal crews. The cesspit or privy vault was the most common solution. Dug into the ground beneath or behind houses, it was lined with brick or timber and often covered by a wooden seat. It collected everything: feces, urine, kitchen waste, bathwater, and sometimes the runoff from nearby stables. In theory, each cesspit was emptied once every few months. In practice, many went years without cleaning, their surfaces crusted, their foundations leaking into the soil. And when the pit finally had to be cleared, the call went out to the night soil men. The process of collection. Here's how it worked. Accessing the pit, The nightmen would arrive after dark, typically in teams of 2 to 6. Using lanterns, they navigated back alleys and yards to locate the privy pit. Some were accessible from outside, others required climbing through kitchens or cellars. Excavation. Using large iron-banded buckets or wooden scoops called dippers, they lifted out the thick slurry of waste and transferred it into barrels or open carts lined with hay or straw to prevent sloshing. Transport. The waste was hauled by cart through the city streets, often covered with tarpaulins, to designated dumping sites. In some cases, it was offloaded onto barges on the Thames, especially during high tide, to be floated downriver to marshy areas outside city limits. Disposal or resale. At the end of their route, the waste was either buried in trenches or sold to farmers and market gardeners as fertilizer. Some collectors had standing contracts with rural estates. The process was remarkably efficient despite its informality and largely self-organizing. There were no city-wide maps or central authorities coordinating routes. Each team of nightmen developed a territory, handed down through apprenticeships or informal agreements. Disputes were rare, but could be severe. A nightman trespassing into another crew's district might find his cart sabotaged or his barrels stolen. Muck and money. Night soil was not just a burden, it was a commodity. A load of well-aged waste, particularly from wealthier homes where the diet was richer and the pits better constructed, was seen as premium material by rural farmers. Records show that in some cases, farmers paid up to 2 shillings per cartload, depending on distance and content. Some nightmen, recognizing the value of this trade, became early waste entrepreneurs, buying up rights to collect from certain homes or neighborhoods, then reselling the muck outside the city for profit. In the mid-18th century, one London night soil collector named Thomas Ward operated a fleet of 6 carts and employed a dozen men. He had contracts with large estates in Essex and Kent, and reportedly earned more than a city magistrate. Still, even the wealthiest nightman was socially invisible. Wealth could not buy respect in a trade associated with filth. A risky business. Working in cesspits was hazardous. One of the most feared dangers was asphyxiation. Decomposing waste produced methane and hydrogen sulfide, which could build up in enclosed pits. Without warning, a worker might inhale a fatal dose and collapse. These incidents were referred to as vapors, and deaths from them were often chalked up as accidents of the trade. Another danger was collapse. Pits dug too deep or improperly supported could cave in. In one recorded case from 1764, a worker in Clerkenwell was buried alive when a cesspit wall gave way. His body was recovered 2 days later. Injuries from falls, infections from cuts, and long-term respiratory issues were common. Most nightmen lived hard, short lives, their strength worn down by the physical demands of lifting, hauling, and breathing in poison. And yet most nights they showed up, quietly, reliably, while the city slept. Regulations and resistance. As the city grew, municipal authorities began introducing regulations to control waste disposal. By the mid-1700s, London had passed laws requiring that waste be removed only at night, carts be covered to prevent spillage, loads be dumped at authorized sites, nightmen be registered with local parishes or wards. These rules aimed to reduce public complaints, especially from middle-class residents who were increasingly sensitive to the smell and visibility of the trade. But enforcement was uneven. Some wealthy residents ignored collection fees, assuming nightmen would come regardless. Others hired cheap, unlicensed workers, rogue tippers, who dumped waste into the nearest ditch or stream. This led to repeated clashes between law-abiding nightmen and illegal operators. In 1778, a crew of licensed collectors protested outside Guildhall, demanding better protections and payment enforcement. It was one of the rare moments when the underbelly of the city came into full view. The city smelled back. Despite their efforts, nightmen were blamed for the very smells they helped prevent. Satirical poems, stage plays, and newspaper columns often portrayed them as loutish, unwashed men spreading disease. And yet, the true culprits of urban stench were often open slaughterhouses, tanneries dumping chemical runoffs, fish markets with no drainage, factories burning coal and animal fats. The air in 18th century London was a stew of sulfur, soot, smoke, and sewage. The smell was inescapable. Wealthier residents burned vinegar-soaked cloths or carried pomanders, hollow balls filled with herbs to ward off the scent. But the poor simply endured it. And in the spaces between rich and poor, between pit and pavement, worked the nightmen, not quite welcomed, not quite forgotten. Stories from the pit. Among the scattered records, we find glimpses of individual nightmen. Edward Grimes, who worked the alleys near Fleet Street and was known for singing hymns as he shoveled. Margaret Roach, a rare woman in the trade who worked with her husband and later took over the route when he fell ill. Black End, so called for his soot-covered face, who reportedly rescued a child who had fallen into an open pit near Rotherhithe. These stories, mostly oral and half-remembered, show that even in the grimiest corners of city life, there was dignity, humor, and humanity. They remind us that history is not only made by generals and kings, but also by those who kept the streets from drowning. A precarious balance. By the early 1800s, London was changing fast. The population had doubled again. Streets were paved, neighborhoods restructured, and early versions of underground sewers were being tested. But for many homes, especially in working-class districts, the cesspit remained king. Night soil men continued their rounds, often unacknowledged, sometimes underpaid, always necessary. They operated in the margins not of legality, but of memory. They were the people the city didn't wish to see, and yet couldn't live without. When we build cities, we think of towers and monuments, but what happens when we forget the people who clean up after us? By the middle of the 19th century, the smell of London had become not just a nuisance, but a crisis. The Thames, once a highway of trade and a supplier of fish and fresh water, had become little more than an open sewer. In the summer of 1858, the heat wave intensified the stench until it was unbearable even inside the Houses of Parliament. Lawmakers soaked curtains in lime and vinegar. Members of Parliament fled sessions early. And finally, with dry throats and pinched noses, they approved funding for one of the greatest engineering feats of Victorian Britain. That moment, known to history as the Great Stink, marked the beginning of the end for the night soil collector. But their disappearance was not sudden, nor was it the result of irrelevance. Rather, it was the inevitable consequence of their own success and the city's delayed acknowledgement of its growing, wasteful complexity. Traces the decline of the gong farmer and the legacy they left behind, both in London's streets and beneath its foundations. The Sewer Revolution. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer with a mind for structure and a stomach for reform. Appointed chief engineer of London's Metropolitan Board of Works, Bazalgette proposed an ambitious plan to construct an integrated sewer network that would divert waste away from the Thames and out toward the sea, using gravity, tide, and enormous underground channels. Over the next 2 decades, Bazalgette and his team built 1,100 miles of street sewers, 82 miles of main intercepting sewers, and embankments along the river that doubled as waste conduits and flood defenses. This new system meant that waste no longer needed to be stored in backyard cesspits. Instead, it could flow directly from homes into the sewers and out of the city silently, invisibly, automatically. And with that shift, the work of the night soil men began to fade. The slow vanishing. The decline did not happen overnight. For decades after the first sewers opened, thousands of homes, especially those in poorer or older neighborhoods, remained disconnected. Cesspits still had to be dug out, privies still overflowed, and so night soil collectors continued their rounds. But their numbers dwindled. Younger men turned to other trades. Licensing systems were disbanded. Cart routes were absorbed into municipal services. By the 1890s, the profession was nearly extinct in central London. In outer boroughs, the work lingered. Records show that even in 1912, certain homes in Hackney and Bethnal Green were still being emptied by hand. But these were rare holdouts, and the people doing the work were no longer called gong farmers. They were sanitation laborers or waste men, city employees wearing uniforms instead of oilcloth. The trade had changed. The name had been erased. What was lost? The disappearance of the gong farmer was not mourned. It was celebrated. To Victorian reformers, their absence meant progress, hygiene, modernity. It meant that the city had finally achieved what its reformers had long demanded: cleanliness, order, and civility. But with the loss of the profession came the loss of something more subtle: the knowledge that comes from living inside a system, not just above it. Nightmen knew the city's underbelly intimately. They knew which alleys always flooded, which yards were built on old marshland, which households lied about the state of their pits. They were the unofficial historians of waste, and their mental maps of the city's hidden infrastructure were never written down. When they vanished, so too did their version of the city, one not of cathedrals and carriages, but of barrels, bricks, drains, and darkness. The hidden infrastructure lives on. Today, when you walk the streets of London or Paris, or Boston, or any city with centuries of life beneath its surface, you walk atop the work of men like these. Cesspits still lie beneath some buildings, long since sealed. Old waste routes are now driveways or bicycle paths. Some sewer lines follow the exact contours of ancient cart tracks, carved over time by the wheels of muck wagons. Occasionally, during construction or excavation, workers uncover layers of compacted waste, sometimes several feet deep, preserved in airless soil. Archaeologists studying these strata call them Midden's treasure troves of information on diet, disease, and daily life. In a way, the gong farmers became accidental archivists, their loads now a key to understanding the past. What was once discarded is now a source of knowledge. The modern echo. Today, sanitation workers are part of a vast, municipal network, trained, equipped, and in theory respected. Their tools are not shovels and scoops, but vacuum pumps, tankers, and treatment facilities. And yet the stigma lingers. Modern waste workers, though protected by unions and safety regulations, are still too often invisible, ignored by a society eager to forget what it discards. Few children dream of becoming garbage collectors. Fewer still know the systems that keep their toilets flushing and their streets clean. We live in many ways further from our waste than ever before. And that distance, while hygienic, also removes us from the reality of what it takes to keep a city functional. The lessons in the mud. What then do we learn from the story of the gong farmer? We learn that no system works without someone cleaning up. We learn that progress depends on the people no one writes about: the nightmen, the diggers, the haulers, the cleaners. We learn that the smooth operation of urban life rests on a foundation of mud, managed by hands we seldom see. And perhaps most of all, we learn that dignity can be found even in the dirtiest of work, in the quiet persistence of those who rise in the dark, light a lantern, and climb into a pit so that the rest of the world may wake to something cleaner. A final reflection. Close your eyes and imagine that same London street, 200 years ago. The night is silent, the moon bright on the cobbles. A cart creaks past, its wheels worn, its load sloshing beneath a thick canvas. A man walks beside it, shoulders hunched, lantern swinging gently with his steps. You don't see him in paintings. You don't read about him in school. But without him, the city would collapse. You owe him your clean morning, your working pipe, your walk down a street that doesn't stink. And he never asked for thanks. And so we end with this quiet question. What does it say about us that the people who kept our cities alive were the ones we worked hardest to forget? Story 4. The letters that never arrived. Somewhere long ago, a letter was written. Its ink was dark and careful, pressed onto rough paper with a sharpened quill. The words were deliberate, though the grammar might have wavered. At the bottom, a name was signed, perhaps with a flourish, perhaps with a shaking hand, and the parchment was folded, sealed, and sent out into the world. But it never arrived. It may have slipped from a courier's pouch in the forest. It may have been soaked in a river crossing. It may have been burned in a war, confiscated by a border guard, or left forgotten at the back of a desk. Its contents were never read. Its news, urgent, ordinary, or loving, vanished into history. And yet, letters like this shaped the pre-modern world just as much as those that survived. In this story, we trace the paths of lost correspondence, the roots, the risks, and the quiet tragedies of the messages that never made it home. The human chain. Before envelopes, stamps, and sorting machines, a letter's journey depended entirely on people. A merchant's apprentice might carry it. So might a soldier, a traveler, a friar on horseback. Kings had messengers and monasteries had scribes. But for most people, sending a letter meant asking a favor, giving your words to someone who was going that way, and hoping they delivered them. There was no guarantee. Sometimes a single letter passed through 5, 10, or more hands before reaching its recipient, each hand adding time, risk, and the possibility of loss. The average delivery time for a message in the 14th century could be weeks or months, depending on distance, weather, and the political situation. If war erupted or a border closed, the letter might wait indefinitely, or be destroyed, or simply vanish. For most people, this was normal. You wrote with the understanding that your letter might never arrive. The risks of the road. A letter on the road faced dangers, both mundane and catastrophic. Whether rain could dissolve ink, snow could trap couriers, floods could wash away entire roads. Theft, bandits often robbed travelers, especially those carrying satchels. Letters were rarely valuable themselves, but they were discarded with everything else. Ignorance. Not every carrier could read. A name or address misunderstood might mean the letter was delivered to the wrong town or never delivered at all. Illness. In times of plague or fever, messengers died mid-journey and their belongings were burned. Borders and war. Letters crossing enemy lines were often seized or destroyed. Messages written in certain languages or scripts were viewed with suspicion. Some were intercepted, copied, then discarded. Others were read aloud as intelligence before vanishing from record. Even peaceful roads were unreliable. A messenger might stop at an inn and forget the bundle. A letter might fall beneath a cart. Rats and mice were constant threats in storage depots and monasteries. No envelope was ever fully secure. Systems without systems. What we now call the mail, a structured, government-run postal service, did not exist in most countries until the 17th or 18th century. Before that, each institution, whether a kingdom, a church, a merchant guild, or a university, developed its own system of communication. In the Holy Roman Empire, for example, the Thurn and Taxis family controlled a private courier network from the 1500s onward, carrying noble correspondence between cities. In Italy, merchant banks like the Medici ran letter systems across Europe, linking Florence, Bruges, and London through a web of trained messengers and cipher clerks. In England, letters between nobles might travel by royal courier, while those between commoners went with traveling tradesmen or passed hand-to-hand through inns. These systems worked, but only for those inside them. For everyone else, the mail was a patchwork of favors, fees, and faith. Letters of love, letters of war. Not all lost letters were transactional. Some carried news that mattered deeply. A wife writes to her husband at war, telling him of a child born or lost. A brother writes of a father's illness, urging his sibling to return. A merchant writes to his partner, warning of famine or opportunity. A servant writes home from a foreign city, asking for money, for prayers, or just for word from home. These are not grand documents. They are short, awkward, written in borrowed Latin or broken script. Many contain misspellings, ink smears, or childish drawings in the margins. And yet they mattered. One such letter, discovered in a hollow wall in York centuries later, read simply, "I write to you with great longing. The ship has not come, and neither has your voice. If you do not come before Candlemas, we will be gone from here." We don't know who wrote it or to whom. We only know it was never sent. Literacy and letters. In medieval and early modern Europe, most people could not write. Even among those who could, writing a letter was often an event requiring ink, paper, and often the help of a scribe. Many towns had letter writers who worked for hire. You told them what to say, they wrote it down, phrased politely or with flair. Some offered secretarial services, storing copies of your letter, or offering to forward it again if needed. These scribes were sometimes viewed with suspicion. Their handwriting might be read by others. Mistakes could distort meaning. In some cases, entire messages were falsified or forged, especially in matters of inheritance or trade. Trust was central. You trusted the writer, you trusted the carrier, and you trusted that your words, however fragile, would survive the journey. Often they didn't. The dead letter. The term dead letter refers today to a piece of mail undeliverable and unreturnable. But before formal postal systems, nearly every lost letter was a dead letter. There was no return address, no guarantee. If your recipient moved or died, the letter stopped moving. Some monasteries collected these letters in chests, hoping someone might one day claim them. Others were burned in batches. Still others, particularly those sent during war, were intercepted, read, and archived by intelligence services. A surprising number of such letters still exist, never delivered, but preserved. The Museum of London, for example, holds letters pulled from the wreck of the Gresham, a mail ship that sank in 1642. Water-damaged and illegible in places, they carry messages from lovers, merchants, and sailors' voices frozen in mid-sentence. Each letter is a conversation never completed. The cost of silence. Sometimes the absence of a letter was its own message. If a son did not write, was he dead? If a husband received no reply, had the wife left? If a merchant's instructions were not followed, was it betrayal or simply a failed delivery? In this way, lost letters could ruin reputations, collapse trade, or break hearts. And yet people kept writing, kept sending, kept believing that their words would reach across distance and through danger. The resilience of the letter writer, especially in a world without certainty, is one of the quieter forms of human courage. The letter leaves the hand of its writer. What happens next is no longer in their control. It may pass through fields and forests, mountains and marketplaces. It may be handed from one stranger to another, tucked in a saddlebag, hidden in a sleeve, or tied under a carriage seat. It is just one item among many, among sacks of wheat, rolls of fabric, or boxes of coins. It travels without escort, without tracking, without promise. And yet, more often than you'd expect, it still finds its way. This section explores the networks, workarounds, and fragile ingenuity of early communication systems, and the surprising resilience of letters carried by trust, memory, and shared purpose. Informal couriers, a world built on favors. For most of history, Letters were not delivered by professionals, they were carried by whoever happened to be going that way. This was known as opportunity post, sending a letter with a traveling merchant, soldier, priest, or pilgrim in the hopes that they would pass it along. A letter from Lyon to Bruges might travel as follows. A merchant rides north with a shipment of cloth. At a fair in Arras, he gives the letter to another trader heading toward Ghent. In Ghent, it passes to a friar traveling to Bruges. The friar arrives and hands it off to a parish clerk who recognizes the recipient's name. Each exchange was informal and entirely dependent on memory, honesty, and human goodwill. There was no payment, no confirmation, and often no reward. Letters were carried out of duty, friendship, or expectation of reciprocity. This informal chain of couriers spanned thousands of miles, a web of roads, rivers, and relationships. And though many letters were lost along the way, many were not. The human chain, for all its weakness, held. The innkeeper's desk. Inns played a vital role in this system. Nearly every town had a central coaching inn, posting house, or tavern where travelers stopped to rest, change horses, or wait out weather. These inns became makeshift post offices. Many kept a public letter desk, a wooden shelf where letters were left for pickup. Some were marked with names, others were open. A wall might hold dozens of folded, sealed messages, each waiting for a hand to carry it forward. You might arrive at an inn and find a message waiting, or find none and leave disappointed. Some innkeepers charged a small fee for holding letters. Others offered to arrange couriers for a price. Some simply offered the service as a courtesy or to curry favor with wealthier clients. In this way, a letter could live for days or weeks in a liminal space, not quite moving, not quite forgotten. The merchant's ledger. Among the earliest people to formalize letter movement were merchants. By the 14th century, powerful trade families like the Medici in Italy, the Fuggers in Germany, or the Crosbys in England maintained intricate systems of correspondence between cities. Letters between branches of a merchant firm carried more than news, they carried exchange rates, crop yields, credit arrangements, and political alerts. To protect their secrets, merchants often used ciphers, codes that masked key words. Some used invented alphabets, others replaced letters with numbers. These early cryptographic systems were stored in private codebooks, guarded with great care. Merchants hired dedicated couriers, who traveled regular routes and reported back on delays or disruptions. In some cases, they paid fees to local rulers for safe passage. These systems were not open to the public, but they often absorbed public letters. A merchant courier might carry a dozen private documents and one folded note from a local artisan to his cousin in another town. The merchant's route was reliable. The artisan paid a small fee. Both benefited. Thus, commerce quietly enabled connection. Letters in war and crisis. Letters were especially vulnerable during war, and yet never more needed. During the 100 Years' War, English and French soldiers sent messages home through monastic way stations. Letters were bundled at abbeys and handed off to monks traveling behind the lines. Some monasteries developed cloister mail systems, with brothers carrying satchels between religious houses. But war introduced risk. Messengers were captured and searched. Enemy languages were treated with suspicion. Religious documents were spared. Secular ones were often burned. In some cases, letters were copied by scribes in central offices and forwarded by multiple routes, a rudimentary form of redundancy. If one was lost, another might survive. One 15th century example shows a merchant from Ghent sending 3 identical letters, one by land through Paris, one by ship to Southampton, and one via the Low Countries to Bruges. Only the third arrived. Women and the word. Though often left out of official records, Women played a crucial role in the world of lost and carried letters. Many served as scribes for illiterate husbands or fathers. Some worked in monasteries as letter writers or archivists. Others carried letters themselves, especially nuns, nurses, or noblewomen with access to courtly travel. Letters from wives, mothers, or daughters were often written with profound care, sometimes more intimate and vulnerable than official correspondence. Examples include a 16th century mother writing to her son in London. I send this with the milk cart. If the man does not come, I will send it with the next or the one after. I do not know if you are well. A nun in Rouen writing to her cousin in Bruges. I enclose the list you asked for. Give my love to the dog if he still lives. These letters often survived by accident, caught in bindings, stuffed into furniture, hidden behind fireplace stones. And yet they reveal a quiet persistence. Women kept writing, even when there was no guarantee they'd be heard. Language and barriers. Letters had to navigate not just roads, but languages. In multilingual empires like Austria-Hungary or the Holy Roman Empire, a letter might pass through zones that spoke German, Latin, Czech, Hungarian, and Italian, each with its own script and conventions. A message written in French might be mistrusted in Spain. A letter in Arabic could be seized in a Catholic port. Even within England, dialects varied enough to cause confusion. This made scribal errors, misread addresses, and accidental rewrites common. One famous case involved a letter addressed to John, the baker near the crooked house by the bell post. It was delivered not to the intended John, but to another man of the same name who read it, misunderstood it, and never passed it on. For the sender, the letter simply disappeared. What letters carried? Not all letters carried words. Some held tokens: a pressed flower, a piece of ribbon, a few foreign coins. These served as proof of identity or symbols of affection or evidence of delivery. A sailor might include a lock of hair for his sweetheart. A merchant might enclose a wax seal. A diplomat might insert a coded phrase that only the reader would understand. The letter was not just information, it was presence. It said, I was here, I remembered, I reached for you. When that letter was lost, something more than parchment disappeared. A letter that never arrives does not scream. It doesn't crumble, it doesn't break, it simply disappears. And yet its absence echoes. A letter not received is a conversation not had, a reunion not made, a warning unheard, a love left unanswered. It is a silence where a voice should be, a pause that stretches until the end of memory. This final section brings the story of lost letters to a close, not by recovering them, but by exploring the quiet, powerful legacy they left behind in history, archives, and absence. Because sometimes, what wasn't said changed just as much as what was. The hidden rooms of history. In the 20th and 21st centuries, as archives opened and historians gained access to private and state collections, thousands of letters once thought lost were found not in the mail, but in baskets, drawers, and pigeonholes that no one had thought to check. Some were sealed but never sent. Others had been intercepted, censored, or misfiled. Some were addressed but never stamped. Still others were returned, but the recipient had long since moved or died. In the archives of the British Library, for example, lie bundles of letters addressed to soldiers in the Crimean War, never delivered, never destroyed. Their contents range from cheerful updates to anxious pleas. Dear Will, we heard of the fighting and are praying. Please let us know if you yet breathe. We have baked you bread, but it may not keep. The bread never left the village. The letter never left the postmaster's drawer. The dead letter office. As mail systems became formalized in the 19th century, most nations established something called a dead letter office. In the U.S., the dead letter office in Washington, D.C., handled millions of undeliverable letters each year. If a letter lacked a return address or was illegible, it was opened, examined, and either destroyed or filed. Thousands of these were love letters, wills, pleas for forgiveness, applications for work, money orders with no name. Workers there lived among the unfinished threads of human lives. They saw the misspellings, the desperation, the birthday cards that never reached a child. It was bureaucratic work, but it touched something deeper. One 1890s worker described it this way: "We hold the ghosts of correspondence, letters no longer alive but not yet at rest." Some of the most remarkable discoveries in these offices were never delivered and never meant to be. People mailed things not to be read but to be released. Confessions, farewells, dreams. Words meant for no one or perhaps for history. A letter sent too late. There are thousands of known cases where a letter, had it arrived, might have changed everything. A French soldier writes home in 1914 to say he is alive, only to be declared dead days before his letter reaches his village. His widow remarries before discovering the truth. A letter from a sailor in the Dutch East Indies, dated 1603, reveals the presence of a rare plant, but is never read by the botanist awaiting it in Amsterdam. The discovery is made 2 decades later by someone else. A colonial governor in Virginia writes to warn his counterpart of a planned rebellion, but the courier drowns en route. The rebellion succeeds. History is shaped as much by what was not known in time as by what was. Each lost letter is a branch not taken. The letter as memory. In literature and diaries, the missing letter becomes a symbol of regret, of love unspoken, of missed fate. Shakespeare often used undelivered letters as dramatic devices. Romeo and Juliet ends in tragedy because a letter warning Romeo of Juliet's fake death never arrives. In Hamlet, a letter ordering Hamlet's death is intercepted and rewritten. Even in fiction, letters control destiny. Their failure is not just narrative, it's existential. The same is true in real life. Many people, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, kept copies of their outgoing letters, sometimes never knowing if the original was read. The copy became a kind of emotional placeholder, proof that the sender had reached out, even if no reply ever came. What mattered was that the letter was written, even if it never reached the other side. When the letters surface, sometime the silence is broken centuries later. In the 2010s, Dutch researchers recovered a trove of undelivered 17th-century letters from a trunk owned by a postmaster in The Hague. The letters had never been opened, thousands of them, and had sat untouched for 300 years. Among them were a musician begging for a position in Paris, a woman asking her cousin to send shoes, a man confessing his love to a woman he could never marry. Each letter, opened at last, gave voice to someone long forgotten. They had never arrived, but they had also never been truly lost. The digital shift, letters without loss. Today, with email and instant messaging, it is nearly impossible for a letter to be truly lost. Your messages, banal, emotional, fragmented, are stored on servers across continents. Even deleted notes may live on in backups, caches, or archive folders. You are living in an age of permanent communication. And yet, the feeling of being unheard still exists. Messages are still missed. Phones go unanswered. Emails are buried under dozens of others. A text read but never replied to can feel just as lost as a letter dropped from a saddlebag in 1327. In some ways, digital abundance has created a new kind of silence, not of distance, but of distraction. The difference is that today, the message survives. The ghost is always there, waiting to be seen. A quiet legacy. So what becomes of the letters that never arrived? They live in footnotes, in boxes, in museums. They live in the sentences not said, in the changes not made. They live in the ways history unfolded because something was not known or known too late. But perhaps most of all, they remind us of this simple truth. Human beings have always tried to reach each other. Across miles, war, storms, and centuries, we have folded words into shapes and sent them into the unknown, hoping to be heard. Not all were, but the act itself, the writing, the sealing, the sending, was an act of faith. And in that act, there is something beautiful. A final reflection. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of a quill scratching paper, the sigh of someone folding a letter, the soft press of a wax seal, the hand that lifts the note and places it in a pouch. A horse exhales. Footsteps fade into the road. The letter is on its way. You may never read it, but it was written, and that matters. So we end this story with a simple, quiet question. What might the world look like if every letter had arrived? Story 5. The Secret Lives of Lantern Watchmen. You are walking alone on a cobbled street. It is the year 1743. The sun has long since set and the city is quiet. There is no hum of street lamps, no glow from neon, only darkness, thick, uneven, and total. But ahead a soft golden light flickers, then another, then another. You are not alone. The night belongs to a man you've likely never thought about. The lantern watchman, the quiet guardian of the pre-industrial night. He moves from post to post, oilkin in hand, tending to the fragile lamps that keep the darkness at bay. He is not a constable, he is not a soldier, he is not a priest. He is something more forgotten, a blend of servant, technician, and timekeeper. And without him, every city after dark would have belonged to shadows. This story is about the ordinary men who lit the night, and what their labor reveals about the unseen infrastructure of early urban life. Before light. To understand the lantern watchman, you must first understand darkness. Before the late 1600s, the night in most cities was absolute. Street lighting did not exist in any formal way. Once the sun set, people lit their own way with torches, candles, or not at all. Streets were dangerous. Markets closed. Alleys became hunting grounds for thieves. Night was something to endure. In wealthier districts, a few private lanterns might burn outside homes if the wind allowed, but the poor walked by starlight if they walked at all. The idea that a city could be lit, that light could be publicly managed, like water or roads, was revolutionary. And it began, quietly, with the appointment of night lantern keepers. Paris, the first flicker. In 1667, under King Louis XIV, the city of Paris undertook a radical urban experiment. They would light the city at night. More than 2,700 oil lanterns were installed across main streets, each tended by workers known as les allumeurs de ravers, the lamp lighters. Each evening, these men walked their assigned circuits, lighting the wicks. They returned at dawn to extinguish them. These early lamps burned vegetable oil or animal fat, giving off a smoky, flickering glow. They were mounted in glass boxes, often hoisted on wooden poles or suspended by chains across alleys. It was not about brightness, it was about presence, a sense that someone, something was watching. Within years, crime dropped in lit areas. Citizens began to walk at night. Paris gained a reputation as La Ville Lumière, the city of light, not for Enlightenment ideals, but for its literal lamps. Soon other cities followed. London, fog, flame, and fuel. By the early 1700s, London had its own version of street lighting, though very different in design. Rather than oils, Londoners used tallow candles, which required frequent trimming and burned with a pungent odor. Lamps were positioned on iron brackets outside shops or nailed to posts. Each evening, city-employed watchmen made their rounds with ladders and torches, relighting candles blown out by wind. One such watchman, William Talbot, wrote in 1739, I carry with me a bag of candles, a small pot of sand, a tinderbox, and the iron rod for raising the glass. It is a poor light we give, but better than none. The job was thankless. Rain ruined wicks, children smashed glass, mobs assaulted lamplighters as symbols of authority. Still, the lights grew in number. By 1740, London boasted over 15,000 lamps, a soft, flickering web across cobbled streets and misty bridges. Each one needed a man to keep it alive. Who were the watchmen? Lantern watchmen were usually older men, past their physical prime but still able to walk and climb. Many were former tradesmen, cobblers, coopers, or sailors who could no longer do heavy labor but could still serve the city. They were not well paid. Wages were irregular. Tools were provided but uniforms were not. Each man was expected to bring his own ladder, oil horn, and often his own flint striker. Work began at dusk and ended at dawn. The job required climbing dozens, sometimes hundreds of ladders per shift, refilling oil or changing candles in cold, wet conditions, recording which lamps had been extinguished, or needed repair. Occasionally, fending off drunks or thieves who used darkness to hide their crimes. There was little room for failure. A single unlit lantern could become the site of a mugging, a fire, or a missing person. Nightlife under oillight. As cities began to light their streets, a new kind of night emerged, one not just for sleeping. People began to stay out longer. Taverns flourished. Early newspapers ran evening editions. Theaters started performances at sunset. Prostitutes and pickpockets followed the light, knowing it drew customers and targets. Lantern watchmen became witnesses to this night society. They knew which homes never extinguished candles. They saw which windows opened for secret visitors. They marked the shops whose owners returned in darkness to move goods without notice. Some watchmen kept quiet. Others reported to local magistrates, acting as unofficial eyes of the law. A few were even paid off to look away. The lamplighter was not just a worker, he was a presence. Part ghost, part sentinel. People noticed when he came, and they noticed when he didn't. Fire, fuel, and failures. Oil lamps were delicate things. Too much oil and they smoked, too little and they sputtered. Glass could crack in the cold, wicks could be stolen. Insects sometimes filled the boxes, drawn to the warmth. Every watchman carried a maintenance kit, spare glass, wire brushes, extra wicks, and rag for soot. Accidents were common. In 1752, a lamplighter in Hamburg tipped over his oil flask, igniting a fire that burned 4 houses. In Amsterdam, a falling ladder broke a lamplighter's back. In Edinburgh, strong winds once extinguished 60 lamps in one night, plunging half the city into blackness. Still, the job endured. Cities learned to stagger their lighting schedules, turning on lamps later during full moons, or reducing service in poor districts. Even in failure, lantern watchmen shaped how cities moved, slept, and thought about night. With this quiet thought, when the sun fell and shadows gathered, someone usually uncelebrated walked through the streets with fire in hand, choosing where light should go. But who lit the lantern man's way? By the time the lanterns were lit and the watchman had moved on, the street had changed. Shadows retreated, doorways revealed their shapes, cobblestones shimmered in dull orange. Cats paused mid-prowl. A sleeping city stirred just a little. But lighting the city wasn't just about sight. It was about control. As cities expanded in the 18th century, the role of the lantern watchman evolved from humble lamplighter to something more complex. A watcher of people, a witness to the night, and sometimes a quiet enforcer of order. This section explores how lantern lighting became a form of social regulation, how lamplighters became reluctant agents of the state, and how the glow of artificial light shaped how people behaved when they thought someone might be watching. More than light, early urban surveillance. In cities like Berlin, Paris, and Vienna, early streetlights weren't just practical, they were symbolic. To be able to light the dark was to claim dominion over it. In the minds of urban planners and officials, darkness meant disorder, immorality, and rebellion. Light meant control, cleanliness, and visibility. And someone had to make sure the light stayed on. The lantern watchman, by virtue of his movement and visibility, became an extension of civic presence. His regular route marked time. His ladder was a sign that someone the city was tending to things. More than once, complaints were lodged not about a broken lamp, but about a watchman skipping a stop. People noticed. They associated his presence with safety, or the illusion of it. Unseen authority. Though not police officers, lantern watchmen often became quasi-authorities, especially in poorer districts. They were sometimes called upon to report broken windows, brawls, or fires, identify bodies found on the street in the early morning, break up gatherings after curfew or during disease outbreaks, track repeated disturbances, such as illegal vendors or night preachers. Most were not trained for this. Many could not read, and yet they were trusted to maintain a kind of informal record: who lived where, who came and went, which alleys hid danger. This wasn't written surveillance. It was folk knowledge, passed between lamplighters like street lore. One 1770s document from Amsterdam lists watchmen reporting the same widow with the green shawl, leaving a tenement every third night after midnight. They didn't intervene, but they saw. And sometimes that was enough. Fear of the light. Not everyone welcomed the lantern man. Criminals, obviously, resented the growing reach of artificial light. So did smugglers, gamblers, and others who had made use of the cover of night. For them, each new lamp was a threat to privacy. But so too did the working poor, especially those who lived and slept near main roads. Light polluted rest. It gave employers reasons to demand longer hours. It revealed faces in windows, even when people didn't wish to be seen. In Naples, riots broke out in 1768 after lanterns were installed in crowded residential zones. People smashed the glass, stole the oil, or blocked the lamps with heavy cloth. One rioter shouted, "Let the night be night again, we work by day." In some cities, laws were passed to protect lanterns. Smashing one could result in prison or public whipping. In others, street lighting was quietly reduced in poor neighborhoods for fear of unrest. And so the lamplighter became, to some, a symbol of intrusion, a reminder that the city was watching. Secret lives and silent paths. Most lantern watchmen knew more than they were supposed to. They noticed patterns. They knew which houses received nightly visits from unknown callers. They saw which stalls reopened after midnight, against regulation. They watched lovers meet, midwives enter silently, and constables ignore corners known for gambling. But they rarely spoke. Most lived alone or in shared houses with other city laborers. They were respected but not befriended. They had no guilds, no official badges. They carried keys, though keys to lamp boxes, to alley gates, to oil stores. In their quiet way, they moved freely through the city when others slept. This made them useful. In some cities, watchmen were recruited for small acts of espionage, delivering messages, reporting on behavior, or observing dissidents. Their reports were valued precisely because they blended into the night. In Leipzig, a watchman was once called to court not because he'd witnessed a crime, but because he was the only person awake who might have. His testimony was vague, but his presence had mattered. Rituals of light. For some cities, lamplighting became a ritual, a marker of time, and an element of civic pride. In Brussels, lamplighters wore green coats with silver buttons and moved in pairs, always starting at the main market square. In Bordeaux, The watchmen sang soft work songs as they lit each lantern, a kind of slow, repetitive lullaby for the neighborhood. Children would wait to see the man with the ladder. In Prague, a small brass bell was rung before the first lamp was lit, signaling that the night had officially begun. These acts turned an ordinary task into something almost sacred. The night was not merely on, it had been ushered in. Even the order of lighting mattered, with main avenues done first, then side streets, then bridges. Each watchman knew his section as intimately as a shepherd knows his field. A lamplighter's ethics. One of the strangest things about lantern watchmen is how quietly moral their job became. There was no official code of ethics, but many saw themselves as protectors, not just of light but of the vulnerable. They kept an eye on drunks too near a canal. They tapped on shutters left open. They carried small flasks of water in case of fainting or fires. A watchman in Edinburgh kept a notebook of names and habits, not for spying, but for knowing who might need help. He once pulled a child from a doorway where she'd been left during the plague. In Ghent, an elderly lamplighter was known for whistling softly before entering courtyards, so residents knew he was near. He did it not for safety, but to avoid scaring women or waking infants. They were caretakers of a strange middle space, not quite family, not quite stranger, present but peripheral. What kind of world requires people to walk the same path every night, lighting the same lamps, watching without speaking, moving without being noticed? And what kind of memory do they leave behind? The ladder stands unused. The wick box is empty. The oil can rusts beneath a window in some forgotten alley. And yet the city is still lit. The lantern watchman, once a fixture of the night, has disappeared, but the lights remain. Brighter now, colder perhaps, and no longer dependent on a single man's silent labor. But behind each glow is a story of transition, from flicker to flame, from human to machine, from presence to automation. We explore how street lighting changed, how the watchman faded into obscurity, and how the modern world inherited his task without ever knowing his name. The arrival of gaslight. By the early 1800s, technology had outpaced oil. The invention of gaslight, pioneered in London in 1807 and rapidly adopted across Europe, offered a cleaner, brighter, and more controllable form of illumination. Instead of oil or candles, pipes fed coal gas directly into street lamps, which were ignited via torch or eventually self-lighting mechanisms. Cities moved quickly to adopt it. London had over 50,000 gas lamps by the mid-19th century. Paris followed, relighting the boulevards with uniform yellow glow. Berlin, Brussels, and Boston embraced it, seeing gaslight as modern and progressive. But it wasn't just a new light. It was a new system. Gaslight required underground piping, new scheduling, and trained technicians. It introduced the role of the gas inspector and eventually central ignition systems that made the laddered lamplighter obsolete. Some cities resisted the change, if only briefly. Older residents complained that gaslight was harsh and sterile. Writers like Charles Dickens mourned the loss of shadowy intimacy in alleys once lit by hand. But the economics were clear. Gas was faster, cheaper, scalable. And with it, the lantern watchman began to vanish. Last of the ladder men. Even as gaslight spread, some towns held out. In small German and Czech villages, traditional oil and candle lanterns remained well into the 1870s. These places clung to their routines and to the men who performed them. In Lucha, Lower Saxony, the same lamplighter served for 43 years, walking a 5-mile circuit each night, carrying a ladder and whistle. When he died in 1883, the town held a small procession, lighting each lamp in his honor one final time. In rural Scotland, a few hamlets employed part-time lamplighters until the 1910s. mostly retired tradesmen given small stipends to maintain community pride. But these were exceptions. By the end of the 19th century, nearly all major cities had adopted gas, and many were experimenting with electric light, a radical, humming technology that required neither oil nor fire. The watchman's shadow grew shorter and dimmer. The electric age, light without touch. Thomas Edison's electric light bulb changed the world, but it also erased a job once filled by tens of thousands. With electricity came automated streetlight grids, timed circuits, and later photosensors. Maintenance crews who worked during the day. No more ladders, no more nightly rounds. The city now lit itself. And while this was a triumph of technology, something quieter was lost: the human rhythm of light, a ritual that had once connected each neighborhood to the movement of one man. The act of lighting the street became impersonal. No longer would someone pause, sigh, and strike flint beneath your window. No one would check if the glass was cracked or if the corner had grown too dark. There was only the switch, the circuit, the system. Progress, yes, but colder, forgotten by history. Despite their significance, lantern watchmen were rarely honored. They left behind few records, no statues, and almost no portraits. Their names, if remembered at all, survive in obscure municipal payrolls or brief mentions in police logs. The work was too ordinary. They were not inventors or generals. They lit lamps. They climbed ladders. They passed like shadows through streets no one now walks without thinking twice. Even in literature, their memory is faint. Dickens mentions them. So does Hugo, but always in passing silhouettes behind the curtain of more important things. It's only recently, through archival work and local histories, that historians have begun to trace their lives and see in them the contours of a labor system that shaped how cities functioned. They were infrastructure before the word existed. Echoes in the modern world. Today, no one walks the streets at dusk with a ladder and oil horn. But there are echoes. The night janitor, who cleans empty buildings before dawn. The early delivery worker, who moves through sleeping neighborhoods. The municipal electrician, who checks wiring at 4 a.m. under sodium glow. The security guard, who walks a slow, silent beat not because danger is certain, but because someone must watch. Each of these roles carries the same quiet weight, presence. They mark the hours not with clocks but with steps. They bring order to places most will never see. They exist on the edge of visibility. Just like the lantern watchman once did. Light as promise. There's one more way the lamplighter lives on, in the idea of what it means to bring light to darkness. In cities around the world, streetlights are still associated with safety, order, and hope. Campaigns to improve lighting in low-income areas often cite a reduction in crime, not just because of visibility, but because light means someone cares. The presence of a working street lamp can signal that a place is tended to, that it matters. In this way, the work of the lantern watchman continues, even if no one climbs a ladder to do it anymore. A final image. It's late now, the street is quiet. You imagine the sound of shoes on wet stone, the creak of a ladder, the hiss of oil as a wick takes flame. A man in a long coat leans into a glass box. He pauses, checks his work, moves on. Behind him, a soft glow lingers, not much, but enough. The street is lit. He does not look back. So we end with a final gentle thought. What does it say about a society that it once paid a man to walk alone through the dark, not to fight crime, or collect taxes, or arrest the unruly, but simply to bring light, one lamp at a time? Story 6. The Bridge Builders Who Never Crossed. You are standing in the middle of a stone bridge. Below, a wide river swells with spring meltwater. Around you, the sound of creaking carts, hoofbeats on stone, and the murmur of merchants fills the morning air. It is the year 1254, and the bridge beneath your feet is a marvel, one that most who cross it never stop to consider. It is not a wooden structure hastily thrown together to ford a narrow stream. This is a massive, multi-arched, stone-built bridge, anchored deep into the riverbed, rising high above floodwaters, and lined not only with parapets but with shops, homes, even small chapels. But this story is not about the bridge itself. It is about the people who built it and never crossed it. Ordinary stonemasons, laborers, and unsung engineers who spent decades crafting a structure they would never own, and often never live long enough to use. This is the story of the bridge builders who never crossed, and what they teach us about faith, time, and forgotten labor. Why build in stone? In early medieval Europe, bridges were usually timber constructions, quick to build and quicker to rot. They collapsed under storms, burned in battles, and were swept away with floods. A stone bridge was something else entirely. It represented permanence, investment, urban aspiration. But it also meant enormous labor and financial risk. Stone bridges required surveying riverbeds by hand, sinking piles into muddy channels, building massive cofferdams, wooden enclosures to divert water, carving and hauling tons of stone, engineering arches that could withstand not just weight, but time. It could take 20, 30, or even 50 years to finish a single bridge. In most cases, the people who began construction were long dead by the time it was completed. They worked for something they would never see. The laborers of the river. Bridge building teams were vast and varied. Masons laid the arches and piers. Carpenters constructed wooden frameworks and scaffolds. Divers and dredgers cleared sediment and set foundations. Blacksmiths forged clamps, tools, and braces. Tilers and roofers covered chapels and shops once the bridge became a street. The conditions were brutal. Working in midstream meant wet clothes, strong currents, and the constant risk of drowning. Men built cofferdams while standing in freezing water, hammering stakes into mud that shifted with each tide. There was no insurance, no safety harnesses, no protective gear. And yet they came, some from the town itself, others from miles away, drawn by promises of steady wages, and perhaps the hope that their children might one day walk the thing they built. Famous bridges, forgotten builders. Take the Pont Valentré in Cahors, France. Begun in 1308, it would not be completed until 1378, 70 years later. The original architect was long dead, so were many of the first masons. Generations passed while the bridge inched toward completion. Or the Old London Bridge, begun in 1176 and finished in 1209. It was funded partly by King Henry II and partly by a religious foundation called the Brethren of the Bridge, who collected donations from across the kingdom. The work was relentless. Workers diverted the Thames, sunk 19 massive piers, and fought ice flows and floods for decades. Few, if any, of the original builders ever saw the final stones laid. Yet they left their names sometimes scratched into mortar joints, or hidden behind carved bosses, initials forever locked inside arches no one sees. Spiritual engineering. Why take on such a task? Because for many, bridge building was not just engineering, it was salvation. In medieval theology, building a bridge was considered a pious act, a form of penance or charitable offering that could save your soul. The church encouraged this. Building a bridge was akin to feeding the hungry or housing the poor. It brought safety and prosperity to a town, enabled pilgrimages, and symbolized unity, the crossing of a divide. As a result, wealthy patrons funded bridge construction as a spiritual legacy. Guilds contributed labor and materials for public benefit. Workers saw their effort not just as toil, but as holy work. Bridge chapels were often placed in the middle of the span, allowing travelers to pray at the heart of the structure, literally in the center of the crossing between here and there. One bridge in Avignon was dedicated to Saint Bénézet, a humble shepherd boy who, legend said, was called by God to build it. His body was placed in a small chapel halfway across the span, a permanent reminder of the sacred duty of connection. A bridge was also a street. By the late 13th century, major bridges became more than crossings. They became towns in themselves. Shops lined the sides: butchers, booksellers, money changers. Some bridges had bakeries, inns, even latrines suspended above the water. This was partly economics. Rent from shopfronts helped fund maintenance. Bridge upkeep was costly, and tolls alone couldn't cover it. Letting merchants pay rent gave bridges an income and a community. In time, people lived on the bridge, raised families, and conducted business without ever touching solid ground. But this liveliness came after the labor. For the men who spent decades carving stones, dredging mud, and hauling timber, the bridge was not a home or a street. It was a task. And when it was done, they moved on or were buried beneath it. What does it mean to build something so massive, so permanent, that you will never see its completion? And what does it say about those who gave their lives to connect two banks of a river, only for others to cross it? The stone was always damp. No matter how bright the sun, no matter how long the cofferdams held the water at bay, there was always a mist clinging to the limestone blocks, a weight to the air near the river's edge. The builders worked in it daily, sleeves rolled, boots soaked, skin weathered by wind and water. And they kept building. Some worked from youth into old age without ever laying the final stone of the bridge they began. Others arrived in the middle of a project already decades old, inheriting plans no longer fully remembered and designs altered more by necessity than vision. They didn't just build bridges, they sustained them. We explore what it meant to devote a life to a bridge, how communities shaped construction, and how bridges came to represent more than mere crossings. A bridge was a generational task. Imagine starting a project at 20 and dying at 60, with the bridge still unfinished. This was the reality for countless medieval bridge builders. Unlike the speed of modern engineering, which allows for massive structures to rise in months or years, medieval stone bridges moved at the pace of mud, weather, and famine. There were no standardized building codes. Each bridge was its own creature, unique to its location, material access, and political fortunes. Interruptions were common. Floods destroyed half-completed piers. Wars diverted funds and labor. Plagues emptied entire crews. Royal deaths caused funding freezes. Religious disputes delayed progress for decades. Yet when work resumed, it often picked up exactly where it left off, a new set of masons stepping in, guided by rough sketches, inherited wisdom, and whatever stones already lay stacked and waiting. In this way, bridges became generational legacies, shaped by hundreds of hands, each adding to a vision they might never see fulfilled. Communities built as much as masons. Though professional stonemasons and engineers handled the core technical work, entire communities contributed to bridge projects in ways we often forget. For example, townswomen carried baskets of lime, water, and food to workers. Children ferried tools between camps on either side of the river. Farmers lent oxen and carts for hauling stone. Local priests offered blessings before risky crossings. Craft guilds sponsored portions of the bridge, carving their emblems into the stone. In many cases, cities would declare certain days as bridge work holidays, requiring every able-bodied citizen to contribute labor or materials. These were called pontage days in England, and they were both civic duties and religious observances. In Toulouse, surviving records show annual parades across unfinished bridges, where townspeople would sing and throw coins into the river as symbolic offerings to ensure the structure's completion. These weren't just construction projects. They were collective acts of hope. The long silence of the master builder. Most bridges had a master mason or bridge master, the chief architect who directed the work and kept the project on course, often for decades. Their role was strange, part engineer, part administrator, part spiritual leader. They drew plans often by hand on parchment, managed labor crews and supply chains, appealed to local lords for funds or exemptions, dealt with floods, theft, disease, and sabotage, and trained apprentices to continue after their death. Few of these master builders are remembered by name. Their roles were seen as service, not spectacle. One exception is Fra Giovanni Giocondo, a Franciscan friar and engineer who helped design bridges in Italy and France in the 15th century. His plans combined Roman and Gothic techniques, and he advocated for beauty as much as function. But most bridge masters lived quiet, itinerant lives moving from town to town, offering their skills and fading into history once the stones set. They left no monuments to themselves, only crossings, bridges as symbols of power and faith. As bridges became larger and more central to urban life, they took on symbolic weight far beyond function. To build a bridge was to say, we are strong enough to master this river. We are rich enough to fund permanence. We are worthy of connection. Many medieval towns placed coats of arms, religious carvings, or inscriptions into the central spans of their bridges declaring ownership and intent. Some bridges had statues of saints or kings. Others featured plaques with prayers for safety. The Ponte Santa Trinita in Florence, originally built in the 13th century, was not just admired for its grace, it was celebrated as a testament to Florentine resilience, rebuilt after every flood, standing firm through conflict. And yet, even these grand statements were supported by the humble men and women whose names are lost, but whose fingerprints remain in the mortar joints and the oddly shaped stones placed not for beauty, but for necessity. Unfinished bridges. Not all bridges were completed. Some were abandoned halfway through, victims of shifting trade routes, exhausted funds, or political collapse. In France, the Pont de Saint-Bénézet in Avignon was begun with great fanfare in the 12th century, but partially destroyed by repeated floods. By the 17th century, only 4 of the original 22 arches remained. Instead of rebuilding, the town let it stand a ruined monument to ambition and impermanence. Elsewhere, bridges were halted mid-construction due to war. In parts of Eastern Europe, half-finished spans were left to crumble, their unused piers now strange islands in the middle of calm rivers. These incomplete bridges are powerful reminders that medieval life was filled with abandonment, not just achievement. To build at all was brave. To finish was miraculous. The builder's bargain. To commit one's life to a bridge, to hauling stones, mixing lime, measuring spans with twine and timber, was to enter into a kind of bargain with time. The laborer's unspoken vow was simple. I will give my body to this task. In return, this bridge will outlive me. Some believed this was a path to divine favor. Others simply hoped their children might one day cross it safely. The builder did not expect reward or recognition, only endurance. There is an old stone bridge in the quiet town of Cahors, France. Its arches stretch confidently over the river Lot, their darkened stone weathered by centuries of rain. Tourists stop for photos. Cars pass without pause. The water below runs softly, as if smoothing over history itself. No one asks who laid the foundation. No one wonders who shaped the keystone. And yet, every curve and angle is a memory of hands, of voices shouting over wind, of scaffolding that once groaned under weight. This final section is about what remains not only of the bridges themselves, but of the people who built and never crossed them, and what that says about how we remember work, sacrifice, and time. Living bridges. Many medieval stone bridges still stand. The Pont Valentré in Cahors, the Pont Neuf in Paris, the Charles Bridge in Prague, the High Bridge in Lincoln, the Pont Vecchio in Florence. Their shapes have changed. Some have had arches widened, balustrades raised, or shops removed. But at their core, they are living artifacts, not museum pieces, but functional structures still carrying daily life. Cars, bicycles, strollers, lovers walking arm in arm, schoolchildren throwing pebbles into the river. They do not pause to think about the 7 centuries of weather or the masons who risked drowning to lay the piers. The bridges somehow are alive, even if their builders are not. The quiet disappearance of the builder. As with lamplighters, the bridge builder, the humble, river-drenched mason, has faded from collective memory. Their work lasted. Their names did not. There are no heroic epics about the men who measured the camber of an arch, or who spent 3 days in the cold water digging out silt so that a cofferdam would hold. Their stories were written in ledgers, not in verse, in stone, not in song. By the time the Renaissance arrived with its interest in individual genius, the bridge builder was no longer central. The era celebrated architects and engineers Leonardo, Brunelleschi, but the anonymous medieval laborer was already gone. And so, over time, the builder disappeared. The bridge remained. Symbols of a worldview. To medieval towns, bridges weren't just tools. They were statements. A bridge said, "We are connected." It said, "We can afford permanence." It said, "We believe the world can be made safer." It's easy to forget how radical that was. In a world filled with bandits, floods, and war, to build a bridge, a stable, freestanding link between 2 sides, was a gesture of trust in both nature and neighbors. That's why bridges were often guarded, blessed, or even exorcised. Some were believed to be cursed, especially those that took too long to finish. In some legends, the devil himself was said to claim the soul of the first to cross a bridge, leading builders to trick him by sending across a dog or rooster first. Even superstition could not undo the bridge. Its meaning endured. When a bridge became a city. On some bridges, life took root. The old London Bridge had 140 shops, homes, and stalls. People spent their entire lives above the Thames, never seeing the water except in glimpses through wooden beams. It was loud, congested, and smoky, but it was home. Bridges became main streets. Their centrality turned them into stages for public life, pageants, processions, even executions. Some became synonymous with the city itself, like the Pont Vecchio, where goldsmiths and jewelers still work today. But none of it would have existed without the unseen generations who shaped the arches below. Their labor was not glamorous. It was not noble. It was simply what needed to be done. Bridges in the modern mind. Today, we take bridges for granted. Concrete spans stretch across rivers, valleys, and highways. They are feats of engineering, yes, but they no longer feel miraculous. Few people stare at a bridge and think about how long it took to build, or who risked their life to sink the footings. But the idea of a bridge as metaphor is still powerful. We speak of building bridges between people, of burning bridges when ties are broken, of someone being a bridge between generations or cultures. Even when we forget the physical bridge builder, we still respect what the bridge represents. Connection, effort, continuity, hope. Lessons from those who never crossed. So what do we learn from those who built and never crossed? We learn that great work is not always seen, that contribution is not always rewarded, that some people give everything to a structure, a cause, a community, a crossing, not for glory, but because it must be done. We live in a world full of bridges we did not build. Our roads, our cities, our languages, they exist because someone before us did the work, made the decisions, laid the stone, and they likely never imagined who would walk across their efforts. Yet they did the work anyway. A final crossing. If you ever walk across a medieval bridge, and you should pause at the center. Look down at the water. Run your hand along the stone railing. Feel how smooth it is, worn not by nature but by centuries of touch. Think of the man who laid that stone, who might have been 40 or 50, coughing from dust and smoke, his fingers cracked from cold, his boots full of river water. He never saw the shops, never saw the bridge bustling with life, never saw you standing there in silence. But he built it for you, for someone. And he crossed the river the only way he could. One stone at a time.